the paper of the last co-chairs, and during the first Security Council debate on ensuring redress for the historic injustice done in Africa. That meeting was held on the 12th of August 2024 under the presidency of Sierra Leone. Furthermore, the Pact for the Future has anchored our common roadmap, which is needed to address Africa as a priority in a special case. We need to preserve this achievement in the spirit and in the letter. In that regard, my delegation extends its appreciation to the states and the groups that support the common African position, and we encourage other parties to follow suit. Thus, African countries being in the category of permanent members is part of ensuring redress for historic injustice. In addition to 2 additional non-permanent meetings, the continent must be given 2 permanent seats, the holders of which will be selected by the African Union to be voted on by the General Assembly. Fourth, addressing the issue of the veto as a matter of privileges strengthens the concern of those that are afraid that the Security Council will have permanent members sitting in it that are stripped of the attributes that they should actually be given. For as long as the veto exists, both new and former permanent members need to fully shoulder the responsibilities incumbent upon them. Furthermore, Senegal continues to advocate, as a member of the C10, for a generalized abolition of the veto. This while we support the French and Mexican initiative aiming to suspend the use of veto in the case of mass atrocities. Fifth, the interdependencies among the 5 pillars of reform require comprehensive negotiation with no silos. Our work must also benefit the working methods of the Council and deepen its relationship with the General Assembly, ensuring their shared and respective competencies are respected. In that regard, it is crucial for the Assembly not only to be an empty sounding board for the disagreements in the Council, but rather it must fully carry out its role as the main deliberative body guiding the action of the Council. In the same vein, it is important to correct, by reviewing working methods, the asymmetries between permanent and non-permanent members, including in terms of initiatives, institutional memory, and decision-making. My delegation welcomes the many convergences of the views and the goals that exist on this thematic area. Therefore, an agreement in principle on the elements of reform would facilitate any text-based negotiation. So it is necessary to support efforts to grasp the positions of the various stakeholders. In that regard, the framework document of 2015 remains a sound reference for any negotiation, and its updating as document 2.0 will underscore its relevance as well. Thank you.
The distinguished representative of Senegal. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of China. China, you have the floor.
Thank you, President. President, thank you for convening this meeting. At the outset, please allow me to congratulate the Permanent Representative of Kuwait, Mr. Al-Banai, and the Permanent Representative of Austria, Mr. Maschik, on their reappointment as co-chairs of the IGN process of the 79th session of the General Assembly. Their reappointment reflects the trust and recognition placed in the co-chairs by member states. China remains committed to maintaining good communication and cooperation with the co-chairs and fully supporting their performance of mandate as conferred by the General Assembly. Against the backdrop of worldwide turmoil, it is the universal demand of the international community that the Security Council should play an effective role in ending hostilities, promoting political settlement, and maintaining world peace. Regrettably, the current operations of the Council are seriously hampered by power politics, geopolitical confrontation, and double standards, leading to the constant erosion of the Council's authority and credibility. The Gaza conflict has been raging for more than a year, resulting in unprecedented casualties and destruction. A certain country has repeatedly blocked the Security Council from taking robust actions, and resolutions already adopted by the Council have not been effectively implemented. This is untenable and unacceptable. China understands the frustration of the wider UN membership over the status quo of the Security Council and the desire to move forward with reform. We support a comprehensive, meaningful, and systematic reform of the Security Council. China would like to emphasize the following points. First, it is imperative to stay committed to the correct direction. The reform of the Security Council must reflect the reality of international politics, mirror an increasingly multipolar world, acknowledging the democratization of international relations as well as the collective rise of the global south. The Council's unreasonable composition, the imbalance of power, and the perennial dominance of a certain bloc bear heavily on the authority and effectiveness of the Council's decision-making. Such is the crux of the matter. The correct direction, therefore, should be an effective increase in the representation of developing countries, allowing more countries with independent foreign policies to join decision-making of the Council. In particular, it is vital to redress the historical injustice suffered by Africa and make priority and special arrangements in response to African aspirations. Second, it is crucial to maintain the status of IGN as the dominant channel. According to GA Decision 62/557, IGN is the only legitimate platform for discussing issues pertaining to the Security Council reform. Any joint action under the UN framework with respect to Security Council reform must be discussed and decided upon in the IGN process. Any attempt to challenge the authority of IGN and start a new process will not receive the support of member states and will only jeopardize the progress achieved so far and undermine the positive momentum. Third, the consensus of member states must be respected. Security Council reform bears on the core interests of the entire UN membership and the foundation of global governance. The process, therefore, should be membership-driven, and its progress should be predicated on consensus of member states. This is fundamental, irrevocable principle. Complex problems have no simple solutions. Any reform plan must take into account the concerns of all sides and must be able to withstand the test of time and history. We firmly oppose forcing through any reform plans, as doing so will only undermine the unity of member states and spark new disagreements. Fourth, the 5 clusters of key issues must be addressed together in a package solution. The 5 cluster issues are at the core of the reform. At present, profound divergences still remain among member states, but this is not a reason to give up dialogue and consultation and turn to a step-by-step or piecemeal approach. All parties should maintain patience, show flexibility, and seek a packaged solution through in-depth discussions and consultations. It should be emphasized that the conditions for text-based negotiations will need to be further accumulated. Hastily launching text-based negotiations before consensus can be reached on key issues will not speed up the negotiation process and will instead lead to more divisions among member states. Fifth, attention must be given to improving the Council's working methods. The multiple problems currently plaguing the work of the Council require a holistic response. If rectifying underrepresentation at the Council is considered treating the root causes, then correcting the Council's unreasonable working methods represents a means to address the symptoms and will be crucial to improving the quality and efficiency of the Council's work. The Pact for the Future requires the Security Council to improve its working methods, including arrangements for penholders and co-penholders. All parties should work together to end the unjust and perennial monopoly of penholdership by a few countries, with a view to enhancing the authority and effectiveness of the Security Council and increase the trust and confidence of the wider membership in this organ. China stands committed to working with all sides in this round of IGN and striving for more progress in a manner that garners the widest possible consensus, reflects the common interests of all member states, and contributes to the long-term development of the United Nations. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of China. I now give the floor to to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for convening this important debate. At the outset, I would like to congratulate the permanent representative of Kuwait and Austria for their reappointment as the co-chairs of the IGN on Security Council reform. Their institutional memory, and most importantly, their wisdom, would bring great benefits to our endeavor to generate progress in the reform process. Mr. President, the ones who bear the brunt of the continued erosion of multilateral values and principles in the Security Councils are civilians in conflict situations. The inability of the Council to act decisively on humanitarian crisis is not merely a failure to adopt outcome documents. It is a matter of life and death. The Security Council must lead by example. The failure of the Council to adopt this month's program of work is proof of their prolonged division and fragmentation and casts serious doubts on its capacity to reach consensus on more substantive matters. Therefore, Security Council reform is essential and timely to ensure that the Council works more effectively and restore its credibility in the eyes of the international community. Against this backdrop, there are 2 points that I would like to make. First, political commitment at the highest level to reform must be continued. The adoption of the Pact of the Future last September brings a glimpse of hope for progress of reform, including in the Security Council. The actions presented in the Pact of the Security Council reform offers us an opportunity to accelerate the reform process. Consensus agreement at the highest level on those actions shows willingness from member states to have a reformed Security Council to be more representative, inclusive, transparent, efficient, effective, democratic, and accountable. Second, progress in the IGN on Security Council reform must be pursued. Every year, we recognize that innovative ideas have been put forward to ensure that the IGN serves its purpose, to find a solution that could garner the widest possible acceptance for reform of the Security Council. Indonesia would welcome the discussion on thematic clusters and also recognizes the merit to continue structured dialogue on models. We believe that more discussion on models would assist us in broadening the convergences and would lead us to a consolidated model for reform. In addition, our future discussion would also benefit from discussing specific sub-actions from the Pact of the Future. Combination of different approaches in the IGN would lead to finding more convergence and bridging divergence among member states. Mr. President, only by exercising our political wisdom and utmost flexibility, the reform of the Security Council would be a reality. Now is the time for us to reform the Council so it would be able to effectively respond to current and future challenges. Rest assured of Indonesia's commitment towards this goal. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Slovakia.
Thank you, Mr. President, Excellencies, dear colleagues. At the outset, let me congratulate Ambassador Tarek Albania, Permanent Representative of the State of Kuwait, and Ambassador Alexander Marcik, Permanent Representative of Austria, for their reappointment as co-chairs of the IGN. I would like to take this opportunity to assure them of our full cooperation and support in their assignment, and I would also like to express our appreciation for their work during the past session. Mr. President, in the recently adopted Pact for the Future, we acknowledged that the challenges and risks to international peace and security are taking on more dangerous forms in traditional and in new domains, and that our efforts to address them must keep the pace. Achieving this requires both, first of all, a committed Security Council that lives up to its mandate, and second, making progress on the UN reform agenda in the area of peace and security. We all need to be personally committed in order to ensure that the decision we have taken during the Summit of the Future turn into reality. The risk of stagnation in the reform efforts can result in further loss of trust among the member states and loss of confidence in the UN system. Mr. President, as we have often reiterated, Slovakia is in the favor of an enlarged Security Council in both its permanent and non-permanent categories, with around 25 members, respecting geographical balance and the need to preserve the Council decision-making capacity. The new members of the Council should, as a principle, have the same responsibilities and obligations as the current members. On enlargement, 3 more points. First, a stronger African presence in both categories of membership has a broad support of the international community and should be addressed as a matter of priority. Second, Slovakia continues to support the aspiration of the G4 countries, Brazil, India, Japan, and Germany. And third, the Reform Council should also include 1 additional non-permanent seat for the Eastern European group. As I said, my delegation is ready to engage in a text-based negotiations, as is the majority of the UN member states. Mr. President, when it comes to the question of veto power, its frequent use in the Security Council is regrettable and concerning. The discussions on discouraging or limiting its scope and use resulted in some productive outcomes, notably the GA 2022 veto initiative. The Pact for the Future calls on us to find a viable agreement on the future of the veto. As far as the working methods are concerned, I wish to acknowledge the steps taken and improvements achieved by the Council so far. Nevertheless, it's clearly a work in progress that must continue in favor of greater transparency and accountability. I would like to commend here the elected members for strengthening their cooperation and joint action in the Council, achieving concrete results despite the diverse nature of the group. Lastly, the mandate of the Security Council, important as it is, has always been a part of a large mission of the United Nations. I believe, therefore, it is imperative for the Council to take further steps to enhance its relations with other relevant UN organs and regional arrangements. Mr. President, in conclusion, my delegation looks forward to engaging constructively in the forthcoming intergovernmental negotiations with a view to move the process forward during the current session of the General Assembly. I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Slovakia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia.
Shukran.
Thank you, Mr. President. In the name of God, most compassionate, most merciful, my delegation aligns itself with the statement by Bahrain on behalf of the Arab group. At the outset, I congratulate Ambassador Tariq Al-Banai
the permanent representative of Kuwait, and Ambassador Alexander Marshik, the representative of Austria, for their reappointment to co-lead the IGN on Security Council reform. We highly appreciate their innovative efforts and the wisdom with which they led the negotiations last session and the progress achieved and the contribution to the Pact of the Future that was adopted during the Summit of the Future last September. We wish them all the success. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, it is well known that member states are increasingly interested in the Security Council reform. It has become a pressing urgency in light of the inability to address the current crises and the challenges facing the world today. The situation is different compared to the time of the foundation of the UN in 1945 and since the first expansion in 1965. Everyone well knows now that the Security Council is unable to fulfill its primary responsibility, which is the maintenance of international peace and security. It no longer fulfills people's aspirations. Accordingly, serious political will is necessary to address the concerns of member states in order to establish a common foundation that can lead to consensus and real and comprehensive reform as desired by all of us through the intergovernmental negotiations, which is the only forum to achieve this result. Mr. President, our meeting today takes place while the Israeli aggression and brutal war against the Palestinians continues. The crimes and violations continue to be inflicted on the Palestinian people by the occupying power. And the aggression is expanding to include Lebanon, which is threatening its territorial integrity and sovereignty. Our brothers and sisters in Lebanon are suffering more aggression, and in return, we find that the Security Council once again is unable to adopt effective and decisive action, which is negatively affecting the stability and security in the region and the credibility of the Council. Ladies and gentlemen, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia welcomes the progress achieved in previous sessions in order to identify the convergences and divergences in the positions of states and groups. And we call for continuing the momentum and building on it while emphasizing the importance of flexibility and continued efforts to bridge the differences and achieve consensus. And based on our continued efforts to achieve the purposes and principles of the UN and the maintenance of international peace and security, and believing in the necessity of Security Council reform as part of comprehensive UN reform, we emphasize the need for states to cooperate and to prioritize the interests of the people of the world in order to achieve our desired outcome, which is a more fair, effective, representative, credible, and transparent Security Council in order to fulfill the aspirations of people and to make this organization fit for purpose. And thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Mr. President, South Africa appreciates the convening of this debate on the long-standing item on reform of the United Nations Security Council. South Africa aligns with the statements of the L69 and the Africa Group. Mr. President, We welcome the reappointment of the co-chairs under whose leadership we seek to find innovative ways to move the negotiations within the context of the intergovernmental negotiations on Security Council reform forward. We must draw on this more ambitious approach as well as an early start of our proceedings to make earnest progress on reforming the Council to respond to the dire need for effective ways as outlined by the UN Charter and to maintain international peace and security. Mr. President, South Africa continues to be concerned and appalled by the inability of the Council to respond to urgent crises such as the ongoing situation in Gaza. This is regrettably prolonging the suffering of the Palestinian people and eroding the credibility and integrity as well as the effectiveness of the Council to fulfill its mandate. Worst still, the Council seems unable, because of the seemingly unwillingness of some to respond to the possibility of a broader conflict in the region, to act. We are all also aware that the question of Palestine is not the only protracted conflict where the Council has been unable to respond. Mr. President, urgent progress on text-based negotiations on Security Council reform will provide an opportunity for reaching consensus through the process of negotiation of our different viewpoints and proposed models for a reformed Council and achieving convergence on its reform. With the adoption of the Pact of the Future by our leaders in September this year, we agreed on guiding principles identified in the intergovernmental negotiations on the question of equitable representation on and increase in the membership of the Security Council and other matters related to the Council. South Africa is pleased that these guiding principles include redressing the historical injustice against Africa as a priority and treating Africa as a special case while improving the representation of underrepresented and unrepresented regions and groups. This approach bolsters our calls to have a Council that is representative of the current global realities. We reaffirm that this redress must be on Africa's own terms and in accordance with a common African position which calls for, and I quote, the full representation of Africa on the Security Council, which means not less than 2 permanent seats with all the prerogatives and privileges of permanent membership, including the right to the veto, as well as 5 non-permanent seats. In this regard, even though Africa is opposed in principle to the veto, it is of the view that so long as it exists, and as a matter of common justice, it should be made available to all permanent members of the Security Council. This is a matter of restoring and preserving the dignity of the African continent, which has long been marginalized in global decision-making processes. Excellencies, decisions can no longer be made about us without us at the table. Furthermore, we must emphasize that the question of the criteria for the selection of African members of the Security Council should be a matter for the African Union to determine, taking into consideration the representative nature and capacity of those who are chosen. Mr. President, we acknowledge that the Pact for the Future also affirmed the guidance that there is a need for intensifying efforts to reach an agreement on the future of the veto, including discussions on limiting its scope and use. South Africa, however, strongly believes that there can be no piecemeal approach to addressing the matter of the veto and its use. While we acknowledge the efforts of Mexico, France, and the Accountability, Coherence and Transparency Act Group's initiative to curtail the use of the veto, we must stress in a similar vein that such piecemeal approaches have not resulted in the prevention of the use of the veto. This gives credence to the need to address the matter of the veto more holistically and supports the common African position that Africa opposes the veto in principle. The veto is a systematic problem or a systemic problem, and it cannot be exclusive the right of 5 members, as it risks perpetuating power disparities and inequalities on the Council. In conclusion, Mr. President, South Africa once again stresses that the credibility of the United Nations is under threat if it is unable to come to the defense of those subjected to prevalent atrocities. If we cannot expedite reform, we risk an ever more divided world, while we retain a council structure that is unable to respond or fulfill its mandate at times of dire crisis. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Australia.
Thank you, President. I'd like to thank the permanent representatives of Austria and Kuwait for their ongoing leadership as co-chairs of the intergovernmental negotiations and congratulate them on their reappointment. They have Australia's full support. Australia has long taken a keen interest in both the membership of as well as equitable representation on the Security Council. Indeed, Australia was actively engaged in a robust debate on both these issues at the time of the very creation of the United Nations. And in those debates, we were consistent in holding out for the principle that equitable geographic distribution is key to ensuring appropriate representation of middle and smaller powers. And if I might be allowed a small historical footnote, Australia's advocacy on this issue led to Australia being elected onto the very first Security Council way back in January 1946, and then holding the very first presidency of that council. Consistent with our long-standing approach, Australia was pleased to support the consensus position in the Pact for the Future agreed earlier this year that the Council must become more representative of the broader United Nations membership. Today, Australia advocates for 3 key positions. First, we support greater permanent and non-permanent representation for Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean, and the Asia-Pacific. Second, Australia strongly supports further exploration of ways to ensure more equitable representation for small island and developing states. And third, we agree strongly with the need to intensify our efforts concerning the future of the veto. Australia opposed the existence of the veto from the very outset. And for as long as the veto remains a feature of Council business, we need greater constraints on and transparency around its use. President, in addition to the above measures, we consider more needs to be done to improve the working methods and transparency of the Council, including by enhancing participation by non-members, increasing consultation and coordination with other United Nations bodies, including the Peacebuilding Commission, and improving the substance of the Security Council's annual report to the General Assembly. Finally, President, Australia's upcoming term on the Peacebuilding Commission and candidacy for a non-permanent seat on the Security Council for 2029-2030 reflect our long-standing commitment to the United Nations peace and security agenda. We stand ready to engage productively in further reform discussions through the intergovernmental negotiations. And we again urge Member States to move to text-based negotiations. In our view, this is the best way to move the dial towards delivering on our collective promise to reform the Security Council in a way that meets the needs of all countries, no matter their size or might. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Australia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I wish to thank you for convening this important debate on Security Council reform. We also thank the President for reappointing Ambassador Alexander Marschek, Permanent Representative of Austria, and Ambassador Tarek Albanai, Permanent Representative of Kuwait, as co-chairs of the intergovernmental negotiations process, and congratulate them on their reappointment. They have made significant contributions during the previous IGN cycle and on the Pact of the Future through a diligent process of consultations to achieve consensus. We are confident that the co-chairs will make a substantive contribution this year as well on the basis of the General Assembly's decision to build on the co-chair's revised elements paper and through an agreed work program of the IGN. Pakistan aligns itself with the statement delivered by Italy on behalf of the UFC, and we would like to add a few points in our national capacity. First and foremost, as Italy stated, we need a reform for all, but especially for the developing countries. Mr. President, it is now more evident than ever, especially after the Gaza conflict, and that the primary reason for the Security Council's frequent failure to respond effectively to conflicts and threats to peace and security is the inability of its permanent members to agree on decisive action. Adding new permanent members will statistically multiply the prospects of paralysis in the Council. The problem cannot be the solution. As many other member states have said, Pakistan also remains staunchly opposed to any proposals for the creation of additional permanent seats for individual member states. Permanent membership was a controversial issue when the Charter was adopted. It remains so today. Permanent membership was imposed into the Charter by the victors of the Second World War as a condition for the creation of the United Nations. There is no such compulsion today, and there is no justification for the creation of new centers of privilege within the United Nations, contrary to the principle of sovereign equality of UN member states. Any country seeking a more frequent presence on the Security Council should do so by subjecting itself to the democratic process of periodic election by the General Assembly. Mr. President, the IGN has held constructive discussions in the previous cycle on all 5 interlinked clusters of issues on Security Council reform. As evident from the co-chair's revised elements paper, the areas of convergence have been broadened and divergences have been further narrowed through the IGN process. However, there remain wide divergences among member states on several key issues within each cluster. On the categories of membership, we are happy to note that there is now a convergence on the expansion of 2-year non-permanent seats. There is no convergence on the creation of new permanent members. It is essential to recall that the discussions involved not just 2 but several categories of membership: 2-year non-permanent seats, longer-term seats, longer-term non-permanent seats, re-electable non-permanent seats, permanent seats representing regions, permanent membership with or without veto, and so on. There are several permutations to the categories of membership. Similarly, there are proposals on the prohibition of the veto, its restriction, its suspension, its expansion, and its deferment. There is also an emerging consensus that the regional approach offers the best prospect for agreement on Security Council reform. On regional representation, the historic injustice against Africa, as well as Asia, Latin America, the SIDS, the Arab group, and the OIC, must be redressed, and the unequal advantage accorded to Europe must be rectified. The UFC's proposal to add 11 or 12 new non-permanent members would offer greater representation to the vast majority of small and medium states, 59 of which have never served on the Security Council. Besides ensuring equitable geopolitical representation, a larger number of non-permanent members would balance the inordinate influence of the 5 permanent members, ensure accountability, and promote the democratization of the Council. On the other hand, the addition of 4 or 6 new permanent members would statistically reduce the prospects for representation for the rest of the 182 member states and expand the circle of the unaccountable in the Security Council. Mr. President, we consider the African demand for 2 permanent seats for the continent as very different from the quest of 4 individual states for permanent membership. As we understand it, the 2 African seats would be filled by states selected by Africa and accountable to Africa, and theoretically could be replaced by Africa. Individual aspirants for permanent membership would be accountable to no one and seek to advance their own national interests and ambitions. In any case, in our multipolar world, there are more than 4 or 6 states. There are over 20 states which can be based on their size, defense capability, economic status, peacekeeping role, contributions to peace and security. There are more than 20 states which could claim the mantle for more frequent representation on the Security Council. The UFC's offer for longer-term seats and equitable regional representation could accommodate the role of these middle powers equitably. Lastly, while considerable progress has been made in promoting convergence on the Council's working methods, there are several additional and innovative proposals which need to be further discussed and agreed. Mr. President, the Pact for the Future confirmed that a consolidated model for Security Council reform will have to be based on the convergences of the 5 clusters. This is the agreement in the Pact. Evolving the language in the Pact confirmed the difficulties of agreed action without convergence on the 5 clusters. It is therefore evident that we will require a substantive, not a perfunctory discussion on each of the 5 clusters, which we have all agreed are interlinked. No consolidated model of Security Council reform can be developed, nor can text-based negotiations start until we have reconciled the key divergences within and between the 5 clusters. The UFC expects that meetings of the IGN will be devoted, as in the past, to each of the 5 clusters and thereafter to their interlinkages across clusters. Mr. President, the Pact for the Future has endorsed early reform, but it has set no artificial deadline. A decision will come when we have the widest possible agreement. Any effort to impose a unilateral decision, as some have threatened, through a voting process will be divisive and, I believe, unsuccessful. It will not only destroy the IGN process, which some seem to desire, but it will also destroy the prospects of early Security Council reform. The UFC remains open to a frank and detailed discussion on ways and means of accommodating the aspirations of all regional and cross-regional groups within an equitable and comprehensive reform of the Security Council. I believe that neither the Arab group nor the OIC member states, 57 of them, will accept a reform in which they are not equitably represented. Mr. President, we are convinced that the UFC's proposal can serve as a framework for such an inclusive and equitable reform of the Security Council. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Pakistan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. Let me start by congratulating Ambassadors Albani and Marshik on their well-deserved reappointment as co-chairs of the intergovernmental negotiations this year. Their leadership and commitment on this important issue was invaluable in agreeing the text on the Security Council reform in the Pact for the Future. We look forward to continuing to work closely with them over the coming months. Last year, when we met to discuss UN Security Council reform in this Assembly, many colleagues reflected on the perilous and dangerous state of the world and the challenge this posed to our multilateral system. A year later, the situation is even more acute, and the need to strengthen our multilateral system through reform ever more pressing. During his address to the UN General Assembly in September, my Prime Minister reflected on the increasingly complex and interconnected challenges the world and our multilateral system are facing. Conflict touches more countries now than at any time in the history of the United Nations, exacting a terrible human toll in Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, and elsewhere in the world. The Security Council's role and its responsibility for international peace and security is as important now as it has ever been. The UK believes that a reformed council, coupled with a collective, renewed commitment to the UN Charter, would strengthen the council so it can continue to rise to the challenges the world is facing. That is why we remain a strong supporter of UN Security Council reform. The council must be expanded to better reflect the world today. We continue to support an expansion in both the permanent and non-permanent categories of membership to a total in the mid-20s. We want to see permanent African representation and permanent seats for Brazil, Germany, India, and Japan. President, we know that agreeing a model of reform for the Security Council will be difficult. It is an important issue on which many states have different views, as we continue to hear today. But it is incumbent on all of us to work together in the spirit of compromise to deliver the change we know is needed. The UK is committed to doing just that, and we look forward to detailed and constructive discussions in the intergovernmental negotiations, which we hope will move us forward towards text-based negotiations. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of United Kingdom. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of San Marino.
Mr. President, I wish to thank you for convening this important debate. We appreciate your commitment in advancing the Security Council reform process, and we thank you for reappointing early on in the process two competent and skillful PRs. San Marino stands ready to constructively support your action and looks forward to cooperating with them in full transparency and willingness to make progress. Mr. President, San Marino joins the statement previously made by Italy on behalf of the Uniting for Consensus Group, and now I would like to make some remarks in my national capacity. We all know that a credible reform of the Security Council requires a comprehensive approach and that member states must drive the negotiations. We believe that the IGN is the right forum for negotiations as it allows a membership-driven process. In accordance with Decision 62/557, the IGN ensured so far an open, transparent, and inclusive process and the participation of all UN member states. San Marino believes that the IGN constitutes the most legitimate and appropriate setting for the discussion on the reform of the Security Council. In our view, the difficulties in achieving a credible reform are not depending on the format of the IGN, but on the substantial divergences of the position on the table. San Marino will engage in the new session of the IGN in a constructive manner, committing itself to integrate the principles of democracy, accountability, transparency in the new reformed Security Council. My country strongly supports the principle that all geographical groups must be fairly represented. San Marino believes that we need to correct the unjust underrepresentation of different regional groups on the Security Council. In fact, a more democratic, representative, accountable, and inclusive Security Council would be a powerful tool for the entire membership and would thus reinforce multilateralism. A fairer representation in the Council of the African continent, Arab countries, small islands, and developing states, and other groups of countries which are underrepresented, would also represent a great opportunity to advance multilateralism in the maintenance of peace and security. It is our understanding that the UFC proposal with the creation of longer-term re-electable seats would be not only an opportunity for promoting a more equitable representation of the Security Council among regional groups, but also could serve as a compromise solution by meeting the aspiration also of these countries that wish to serve longer in the country. At the same time, through periodic elections of its new members, the Security Council would certainly be more democratic and accountable. Mr. President, at some point we should ask ourselves what proposal will make the Council more democratic, representative, accountable, but most of all more efficient than the Council we have today. If the veto power is one of the causes of the inefficiency of the Security Council, it is not by adding new permanent seats that we will succeed in our reform. More permanent seats and veto powers will make the Council less capable to fulfill its duties. This is also one of the reasons why we oppose any enlargement of the Security Council in its permanent seats. In conclusion, Mr. President, I believe that it is more important than ever to continue to work together, trying to find commonalities among us, and thus forge a stronger political consensus on this vital reform. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of San Marino. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kyrgyzstan.
Dear President, I wish to start my statement by thanking you for convening this important debate. Kyrgyzstan fully supports your decision on reappointing distinguished ambassadors Alexander Marshik of Austria and Tariq Albanai of Kuwait as co-chairs of intergovernmental negotiations. I wish them much of success during this session and assure that they can also count on us in our support in leading the IGN forward. Before addressing the question in substance, I wish to note that Kyrgyzstan is not part of any informal groupings active in the intergovernmental process. In the meantime, Kyrgyzstan stands ready to work with each and every party with view of ensuring that our perspectives as a small state are well needed. Dear colleagues, Kyrgyzstan considers the question of equitable representation on and increasing the membership of the Security Council as a #1 priority in the IGN process. We believe that expansion of the Council composition would contribute towards achieving our common goal of a more inclusive, transparent, accountable, and effective Council in the 21st century. Kyrgyzstan subscribes to a view that some regions and groups of states remain underrepresented and even unrepresented in the Council. And in this regard, first, Kyrgyzstan recognizes the legitimate aspiration of the African states for the enlarged membership in the Council. We share the perspective vision of the African group on their enhanced representation in the Council. Second, Kyrgyzstan notes with dismay that more than 50 small states have never served on the Council. In this regard, we welcome the tabled proposals that recognize the need for resolving the question of representation of the small states and small island developing states in the Council. In conclusion, I need to bring to the attention of the General Assembly that my country, Kyrgyzstan, is among those small states that have yet to serve on the Council. In this connection, we look forward to unanimous support from the fellow member states in redressing such a historical injustice and electing Kyrgyzstan as a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council in June 2026. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Kyrgyzstan, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. Turkey fully aligns itself with the statement delivered by the permanent representative of Italy on behalf of the Uniting for Consensus Group. I would also like to make the following statement in my national capacity. Mr. President, we appreciate your engagement in the process and warmly welcome the reappointment of permanent representatives of Austria and Kuwait in their capacities as the co-facilitators of the IGN. They have our full support and cooperation, and we depend on their fair and balanced leadership. Mr. President, as constantly voiced by wider membership and citizens of the world, the need for Security Council reform is undeniable and inevitable. This process can no longer be deferred. Nevertheless, we cannot and should not rush this course before calibrating our differences, increasing our convergences, and achieving the widest political agreement on the main parameters of Security Council reform identified by this august body. Mr. President, time and again, we have witnessed the dysfunctionality of the Security Council, which was established in a different era. Our collective and constructive efforts must focus on a reform council that reflects today's realities and fits to address contemporary challenges with the capacity to fairly represent people of all origins, faiths, and cultures in the world. This entails a comprehensive and inclusive approach that benefits all member states, prioritizing common good over individual national interest. The reformed Security Council must be effective and functional, more transparent and democratic, while ensuring accountability. The use of veto is a clear impediment on our way forward. Ideally, the veto should be abolished. At best, limiting the use and framework of negative vote, especially under specific circumstances, is paramount. We should concentrate our efforts on observing the principle of fair, democratic, inclusive, and equitable representation in the Security Council. This is attainable if the number of elected seats is increased so as to ensure more equitable regional representation from underrepresented regions with a fair system of rotation through regular elections. This is the only feasible and constructive approach now to address the historic injustices against Africa and the developing countries whose voices need to be heard more than ever. Last but not least, we should keep working on strengthening coordination and cooperation between the Security Council and the General Assembly. This can only be achieved under the IGN, the sole legitimate platform to handle this delicate matter, in which we have proven to identify numerous points of convergences and establish momentum for progress in the 5 main clusters. We call on all member states to demonstrate the political will and constructive flexibility to facilitate the reform process. We also call on negotiating groups and countries who have not done so far to present their own models so as to enrich discussions in the IGN. Mr. President, the reform of the Security Council, which has direct impact on the lives of current and future generations, requires compromise and a consensual process. A genuine approach to improve the Security Council should focus on the most feasible model, which can garner the largest political agreement in a swift manner. We therefore, once again, urge all member states to assess constructively the compromise solution of the Uniting for Consensus group during the IGN process. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Turkey, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Paraguay.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. For the Republic of Paraguay, the issue of equitable representation in the Security Council is a matter of the utmost importance because of the central nature of this organ to the Charter and the cornerstone that it plays with regard to its mandate for the maintenance of international peace and security, one of the pillars on which this organization is based. During the last General Assembly and the Summit of the Future, a significant majority of heads of state and government made a reference to this subject, including Paraguay, when we stressed that it is imperative, indeed it is a duty, to redefine the functioning of the institutions of multilateralism, which undoubtedly includes the Security Council. Mr. President, our delegation reaffirms that this General Assembly has a high level of responsibility in trying to bring about a reform of the Security Council to make it an efficient, transparent, representative organ that is able to respond to geopolitical realities. The number and the violence of these active conflicts only confirms the obsolete nature of the current format of the Council. In this regard, we would state that the appropriate way to bring about this is through the IGN. A genuine reform can only come through the membership of this organization in their desire to be worthy of respect and esteem of future generations. We have the feeling that we are now in the best position to renounce maximalist positions in favor of the common good. Mr. President, we would particularly like to underscore the work of the co-facilitators in the IGN, distinguished ambassadors of Austria and Kuwait, and we assure them of the full support of the delegation of Paraguay in their work. The reform that we are referring to should have as one of its main goals the dynamic and rotating participation of a much greater number of countries, which will be representative of the actual membership, and for that it will be necessary for there to be an increase in the number of members. And we also need to make progress in the other areas of membership, such as the issue of the veto and the formalization of the methods of work. Paraguay believes that after so many years of discussion, the process now is mature, and we should move towards the necessary consensus in order to bring about this reform. Finally, as a landlocked country that has renounced war, Paraguay believes that the only path towards peace is multilateralism and international cooperation, and in this context, the revitalization of the work of this General Assembly and the reform of the Security Council are necessary conditions for improvement in the achievement of the goals which we have set ourselves as members of the United Nations Charter in the current context. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Paraguay. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this debate and for the commitment to advancing the Security Council reform process. The United Arab Emirates aligns itself with the statement delivered by the Kingdom of Bahrain on behalf of the Arab group. I congratulate Ambassador Al-Bannai and Ambassador Marshik on their reappointment as co-chairs of the intergovernmental negotiations. Their innovative leadership allowed us to make meaningful progress, including on improving transparency and building institutional memory. Thanks to their skillful navigation of the process, we were able to agree a text that addresses Security Council reform in the Pact of the Future. We welcome the co-chairs' continued facilitation and look forward to the IGN meetings starting later this month. Mr. President, these are challenging times for the United Nations. Rising conflicts and growing polarization have put immense pressure on a Security Council whose composition reflects outdated geopolitical realities. The Council's inability to tackle some of the most critical threats to peace and security risks undermining its credibility and purpose, as well as eroding international norms. The need for reform grows ever more urgent, yet it remains stubbornly elusive. The United Arab Emirates looks forward to considering the models that member states and groups will present, and to the development by the co-chairs of a consolidated model based on convergences across the 5 clusters. The UAE will come to this exercise with an open mind. We hope others do the same, so that we can collectively identify solutions that will garner political consensus. Mr. President, the Security Council's current composition does not reflect the diversity of the international community, particularly the Global South. Many regions remain underrepresented in both the permanent and non-permanent categories. This includes the Latin America and Caribbean region, the Asia-Pacific region, as well as Africa and the Arab world, the regions with the most at stake in the Council's agenda. Last year, 38% of the Council's meetings focused on Africa, while more than 33% addressed Middle East issues. The UAE reiterates the Arab group's appeal for increased Arab representation on the Council, and we welcome the agreement in the Pact for the Future to continue discussions on this issue. We also recognize the legitimate aspirations of African countries for an increased presence in the Council, as reflected in the Ezulwini Consensus and the CERT Declaration. Mr. President, when the UN was created in the ashes of World War II, its founders envisaged the veto as a means to support the maintenance of international peace and security. However, its frequent misuse has undermined the Council's effectiveness and paralyzed decision-making. Therefore, any meaningful discussion on Council reform must include limitations and guardrails on the use of the veto. In the meantime, we should continue to explore other initiatives that could encourage more appropriate use of the veto. Mr. President, despite the deep divisions on some issues, we can all agree on the need for meaningful reform to restore trust and credibility in the Council, Achieving this will require good faith negotiations and a willingness to compromise. It is time to set aside our differences and work together towards a more representative and effective Security Council. The future of our multilateral system and of international peace and security depends on it. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Salvador.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. El Salvador would like to thank you for convening this important debate on the reform of the Security Council. I'd like to take this opportunity to recognize the leadership of the distinguished ambassadors Tariq Al-Banai, Permanent Representative of Kuwait, and Alexander Marshik, Permanent Representative of Austria, as co-chairs of the intergovernmental negotiating process. We congratulate both of them on their reappointment, and we have full trust that under their able leadership we will continue to make progress in these discussions. Today is a decisive time. Unless there is a structural reform, the Security Council and the United Nations run the risk of not just losing their efficiency, but also their legitimacy and their credibility. This lack of action has real consequences. Millions of people affected by conflicts continue to suffer, trapped in a system that is incapable of adequately responding to their needs. The wars are continuing, violations of human rights are getting worse, and the forced displacement is becoming a constant state of affairs for millions of people. When the Council is not able to act because its decisions are blocked, this inaction means that humanitarian crises get worse, leaving millions of people without access to food, water, medical care, and shelter. This cycle of inefficiency not only perpetuates human suffering, but also erodes confidence in the multilateral system and the ability of the United Nations to comply with its mandate to preserve international peace and security. This is why deliberations on the reform of the Security Council are more relevant now than they ever were before. The current circumstances mean that we must bring about a transformative consensus that will make it possible for this organ to fulfill its responsibilities effectively and in a timely manner. Mr. President, El Salvador supports a reform of the Security Council that will make it a more democratic, representative, inclusive, legitimate, efficient, and transparent organ. We believe in a council which acts quickly and responsibly to address conflicts and threats to peace. In order to bring about a genuinely representative council, we support an increase in the number of elected members. Recent events have demonstrated the significant contributions that these members make in facilitating balanced and meaningful agreements. It's fundamental that the Council better reflect the current composition of the United Nations, and that it increase the participation of regions and countries that historically have been underrepresented, including our region, Latin America and the Caribbean. This change would not only correct a historic injustice, but it would also strengthen a diversity of perspectives in the search for solutions to international peace and security. Mr. President, the disproportionate use of the veto by some permanent members is a serious concern for my country. This privilege has paralyzed the Council, and it has seriously damaged its credibility, affecting the legitimacy of the entire organization. El Salvador will continue to promote a reform which eliminates the possibility of one single state imposing its will over everyone else. If this mechanism does continue to exist, we think it's crucial to limit its use. In this regard,
we have supported the political declaration on suspension of veto powers in case of mass atrocities, which was launched by Mexico and France, and the Code of Conduct for response of the Security Council in cases of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, promoted by the ACT group. We call upon states that have not yet done so to join these commitments. Likewise, we support the strengthening of the relationship between the Security Council and the General Assembly. The veto initiative, that was through Resolution 72/269, and the synergies between the process of council reform and the process of revitalization of the General Assembly are crucial opportunities to improve accountability and transparency in our collective work. We also believe that an improvement in the Council's working methods would be an invaluable opportunity to make it more efficient and accessible in the way that it functions. We call upon the co-chairs to continue to put forward the proposals of the member states to the informal working group on documentation and Security Council procedures. And we would call upon the Council to increase the participation and access for all member states to its work in order to strengthen its transparency and the trust that we have in the system. For more than a decade now, the process of intergovernmental negotiations has mainly been a forum where groups and member states have reiterated their positions without reaching concrete agreements. For this reason, the progress that was made in the Pact for the Future and the guiding principles for reforming the Security Council represent significant progress that must be recognized. However, a lot still remains to be done to meet the goal that was laid out in Decision 62/557. In order to achieve this, it's essential that member states commit to an in-depth dialogue that is realistic and pragmatic, addressing flexibly the existing discrepancies. We would call upon all states to involve themselves in a constructive way, honoring the commitment of the Pact to intensify our efforts as part of the intergovernmental negotiations. In conclusion, Mr. President, we reaffirm the commitment of El Salvador to participate actively in future deliberations on the urgent reform of the Security Council. This process is essential to guarantee that the United Nations can respond effectively to the challenges of our time and meet its mandate of protecting the most vulnerable. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of El Salvador. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Zimbabwe.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this plenary meeting. At the outset, my delegation welcomes the reappointment of the permanent representatives of Austria and the State of Kuwait as co-chairs of the IGN process. We congratulate the co-chairs on their reappointment and pledge to work with them in building upon the gains achieved thus far in this reform process. Mr. President, Zimbabwe aligns itself with the statement delivered by the permanent representative of Sierra Leone on behalf of the African Group, and I will deliver the following remarks in a national capacity. The debate on the reform of the United Nations Security Council remains as paramount today as it was when the topic was first introduced on the agenda of the General Assembly in 1979. In that regard, my delegation is encouraged by the growing calls for the reform of this principal organ of the United Nations to make it more representative, democratic, inclusive, transparent, efficient, effective, and accountable, as outlined in Action 39 of the Pact for the Future, which our heads of state and government endorsed in September 2024. My delegation also welcomes the broad support among the member states to prioritize addressing the historical injustice against Africa as part of efforts towards reforming the outdated global governance architecture to make it more responsive to the pressing challenges of the 21st century. This redress would ensure appropriate representation on the Council, thereby allowing the continent to have a greater voice in the decisions that directly involve Africa, in addition to its significant contributions to global peace and security, both financially and through troop contributions. In this context, the demand for 2 permanent seats and 5 non-permanent seats for Africa, as espoused in the Ezulini Consensus and reaffirmed in the City Declaration, with all the prerogatives and privileges of the current members, including the veto power, is welcome. This is what would accord Africa its requisite role in shaping the global peace and security architecture. Further delay in addressing the current status quo risks prolonging the existing imbalance and limiting Africa's ability to meaningfully contribute to the key peacekeeping decisions that directly impact the continent. My delegation looks forward to engaging in constructive dialogue and working with the entire membership to bring about a comprehensive reform that reflects the needs and aspirations of the global community, especially those regions that have been historically marginalized. To that end, the IGN remains the most legitimate platform to pursue a holistic reform of the Security Council in line with General Assembly Decision 62/557. To conclude, Mr. President, my delegation reiterates its commitment to working with the entire membership to build on the progress achieved thus far. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Zimbabwe. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, let me first take this opportunity to congratulate Their Excellencies Tarek Al-Banai, Permanent Representative of the State of Kuwait, and Alexander Marchik, Permanent Representative of Austria, on their reappointment as co-chairs of the intergovernmental negotiations on the question of equitable representation and increase in the membership of the Security Council and other matters related to the Council for the 79th session. Guyana also commends both permanent representatives for their exceptional leadership during the 78th session and applauds their significant efforts to achieve progress in the IGN. We were especially encouraged that through their leadership, the IGN was able to make a consensual input into the just adopted Pact for the Future. On this latter note, Guyana takes seriously the commitment made by our leaders to strengthen the IGN, and we hope to work closely with the entire membership to achieve early and urgent reform. Mr. President, there is a widespread call across the UN and the international community as a whole for the Security Council to undergo significant changes if it is to truly become fit for purpose and fulfill its mandate as set out in the Charter. The Council is undoubtedly one of the most important mechanisms through which effective action can be taken to secure peace for peoples across every corner of our world. However, after nearly 2 decades since intergovernmental negotiations formally commenced, Security Council reform appears to be an intractable challenge, though its urgency has not subsided. Indeed, reform has come into deeper focus in recent times and is now more urgent than ever. Mr. President, nearly 8 decades after the UN's establishment, its membership has nearly quadrupled. Several new global economic powers have emerged, and geopolitical relations are in constant flux. Put simply, we are in a vastly changed world, and yet the Council has not adapted to respond to these changes, with its composition expanding only once in 1965. It is demonstrably not sufficient and morally wrong that 78 years after its establishment, the Security Council is controlled
by 2.5% of the membership of the United Nations. More can and must be done to create a Security Council that is more representative, transparent, and agile. For most of the world's citizens, the Council is viewed as an ineffective and unjust body, controlled by the world's superpowers, who are more interested in advancing their own interests than in achieving peace. They have seen, for example, how the veto continues to stymie Council action at critical times when civilians, including thousands of children, are in urgent need of protection. Our citizens have started questioning even the utility of the Council. In such an environment, the Council risks becoming irrelevant. To restore both the Council's effectiveness and its legitimacy in the public eye, we must transform its outdated composition and unfair decision-making rules. Mr. President, the matter of equitable representation must remain a primary priority of any package of reforms that are proposed. Guyana supports expansion in both the permanent and non-permanent categories of membership, and is of the view that this expansion should be done on a regional basis. This includes permanent membership for Africa and for my own Latin American and Caribbean region, which are the only regions not represented in the permanent category. The impacts of Africa's underrepresentation on the Council cannot be ignored, and Guyana takes this opportunity to reaffirm our support for the common African position as expressed in the Esselwini Consensus and CERT Declaration. Africa has demonstrated that it has a strong comparative advantage in matters of peace and security on the continent, and its allotted representation on the Council should reflect that, both in terms of numbers and decision-making prerogatives. Also of critical concern is the use of the veto. In recent times, we have seen over and over again that the ability of only a privileged few to wield unfettered power to block the will of the majority is at the root of the Council's dysfunction. The ability of the permanent members to unilaterally block action seen to be at odds with their own national interests is unsustainable. Guyana is a firm proponent for the abolition of the veto. However, in any scenario where it continues to exist, this power must be extended to all new permanent members. To create a situation of separate and unequal classes of permanent membership will only perpetuate existing imbalances. Mr. President, I close with a recognition that Council reform is not elusive, even though it is tempting to despair, given the years that have elapsed since reform was first placed on the agenda. We must redouble our diplomatic efforts and continue to work to achieve reform. The stakes of this debate are as high as they have ever been. Continued failure will breed disenchantment and disorder. Our collective security and stability are inextricably linked. The impacts of conflicts are not confined to borders, and as such, each of us has an obligation, a responsibility, to be fully committed to this effort and to long last make substantial and tangible leaps forward toward reforming the Security Council. Guyana believes that new life has been instilled in the process and the needle has started to move. Let us take it further. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Guyana, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are grateful for you convening this meeting to continue to debate a matter that is essential on the United Nations agenda, namely the reform of the Security Council. Allow me to begin by congratulating the permanent representatives of Kuwait and Austria on their appointment once again as co-chairs of the intergovernmental negotiations on the issue of equitable representation on the Security Council and an increase in the number of members and other related matters during the 79th session. And we wish you every success in your work, and we give you our full support in this process. And we also praise you for your efforts during the previous session. Mr. President, this is an opportunity that we should make the most of to have a good exchange between member states and continue to address the necessary reform of this organ through detailed discussion of the 5 clusters as stipulated in the decision of the General Assembly. The reform of the Security Council is a historic matter. We once again are in favour of complete reform of the Security Council, including its working methods, in order to make this an organ that is really transparent, democratic and representative. In order to achieve this goal, we need informal, transparent negotiations and the closed consultations of the Council should be the exception, not the rule, and the rules of procedure should be adopted, which continue to be provisional. The annual report that is presented to this General Assembly must be exhaustive and analytical with regard to the work of the Council that will help us to assess the causes and implications of their decisions. With regard to the membership of the Council, Cuba has always advocated for an increase in both category of members, permanent and non-permanent, in order to have a more balanced representation geographically and deal with the underrepresentation of developed countries, because they make up the great majority of the membership of the United Nations. This is a historic demand. As we've said previously, this increase should not be partial or selective, and it should not be to the detriment of developing countries if we increase the membership. There should be no fewer than 26 members. That increase should include an increase in new permanent members. There's a minimum 2 countries from Africa, 2 developing from Asia, and 2 from Latin America and the Caribbean, so that they are part of relevant decisions to be adopted by the Security Council. It's not right that entire regions such as Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean are not represented in that category. Likewise, the category of non-permanent members should be increased to at least 15 members. Mr. President, we are not in favour of creating new categories or subcategories of members, because that would increase the differences that exist and make them even worse within the Security Council. Cuba has always been against the right to veto. However, unless that is eliminated, the new seats established in the category of permanent members should have the same prerogatives and rights as the current permanent members, including the right to veto. There should not be selective criteria or discriminatory criteria created in this regard. Another thing that we think is essential is that there should no longer be action by the Security Council in areas that are not part of its mandate, particularly General Assembly affairs. The functions and mandates that are established in the Charter of the United Nations must be respected. In conclusion, we are prepared to continue to make progress towards a solution that will meet with the widest possible consensus among members, and we will continue to promote multilateralism and the credibility of the United Nations. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cuba, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Equatorial Guinea.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, President. Mr. President, allow me to begin my statement by thanking you for convening today's debate on the question of equitable representation on and increase in the membership of the Security Council and other matters related to the Security Council, and for you shedding further light on this issue during your opening statement to this debate. We're also happy that you have once again decided to select Their Excellencies Mr. Tariq Al-Banai and Alexander Marshik, permanent representatives of the state of Kuwait and Austria, respectively, as co-facilitators for the intergovernmental negotiations on the reform of the Security Council for this session. Given that their experience gathered during the preceding two sessions, the 77th and 78th of the General Assembly, will help us to continue to build on the progress made to date, such as the creation of a web page for the IGN, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Process, giving the possibility to follow meetings online as well as informal meetings. These successes are to be lauded, and we will always support these initiatives as we pursue our goal to bring about broad consensus with regard to Security Council reform. Mr. President, Equatorial Guinea fully aligns itself with the statements delivered by the permanent representative of Sierra Leone on behalf of the African Group, and we'd like to make the following comments in our national capacity. We believe that it is very necessary that there be a comprehensive reform of the United Nations Security Council so that it is able to meet its responsibilities with regard to international peace and security. It's clear to us that the principles, goals, and ideals of the United Nations Charter require a world that is more just, that is based on universalism, impartiality, and regional balance. However, and despite the constant geopolitical changes and the new realities which we have seen throughout the almost 80 years of existence of the United Nations, the Security Council remains unmoved by these changes. And this lack of change negatively affects its efficiency, its legitimacy, and its ability to address modern global challenges. The current composition of the permanent members of the Security Council and the number of non-permanent members does not adequately reflect the current geopolitical situation. The structure leaves the African continent and very many regions and emerging powers underrepresented, thus affecting the legitimacy and efficiency of this important organ of the United Nations with decision-making power. The capacity of the United Nations to address current challenges is being limited because very many of these challenges require solutions which reflect the collective action and cooperation between regions. Unfortunately, the lack of a comprehensive reform of the Security Council is leading to marginalization of the voices of developing countries, and it is their issues that occupy virtually the entire Security Council agenda, and therefore visibility is not being given to these regions which are not properly represented, and this creates a lack of trust which day by day is eroding the relevance and effectiveness not only of the Security Council but also of the United Nations system. The power of veto enjoyed by the 5 permanent members makes it possible for any one of them to block resolutions in an arbitrary manner, including those resolutions which have broad support amongst the international community. The use of the veto in an arbitrary and irresponsible manner has on very many occasions led to a deadlock in the Security Council with regard to important actions and measures that were decisive, but they were paralyzed or prevented due to the interests of one or several countries. And we have been able to see this in the recent conflicts and crises underway. And we are very concerned as we see that after a resolution has been vetoed in the Security Council, a measure or an action is vetoed in the Security Council, and after this subject has then been debated in the General Assembly so that we know the opinion of the majority, this still seems to have no effect in terms of revising or revoking the veto that was cast. Mr. President, with more inclusive representation, the Security Council could better address the various sources of conflict in regions that are underrepresented, such as is the case for the African continent, which, despite accounting for a lot of the Council agenda, continues to not be adequately represented. The Common African Position, which is reflected in the Esselwini Consensus and the CERT Declaration, is very clear in this regard. No fewer than 2 seats in the category of permanent members, with all of the prerogatives including the right to veto, and 5 seats in the category of non-permanent members. Africa cannot continue to be absent from the critical debates which affect their development to a greater extent. This is why we very much welcome the general consensus between members to correct this historic injustice against Africa and the need to treat Africa as a special priority case in the IGN process, as was included in the Pact for the Future adopted this last September by our leaders during the high-level week of the General Assembly. This success should provide impetus and guide us as we make progress in reform of the Security Council, thus promoting the necessary political will that we need to reduce the differences that exist between interest groups and move forward towards the process of intergovernmental negotiations. And that is why we are always available to meet with other groups and interests. These meetings, such as the very fruitful ministerial meeting between the C10 and the P5, for example, gives us the opportunity to hear other points of view that help us to think about how we can address differences and reduce them as far as possible. And finally, in conclusion, Mr. President, we would like to underscore that unless there is comprehensive, transparent and inclusive reform of the Security Council, it won't only lose its credibility and legitimacy, but also it will lose its ability to better meet its obligations with regard to the maintenance of international peace and security in a world that is increasingly multipolar. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Equatorial Guinea, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malta.
President, we thank you for convening today's debate ahead of upcoming discussions in the IGN on Security Council reform. We also congratulate Austria and Kuwait for being reappointed as co-chairs of this important process. Malta aligns itself with the statement delivered by Italy on behalf of the UFC group and would like to add a few remarks in its national capacity. President, Malta reiterates the importance of multilateralism and multilateral cooperation on matters pertaining to the international peace and security. A comprehensive reform of the Security Council will reinforce these long-standing values while making the Council more effective, efficient, transparent, accountable, and democratic. Our primary goal must be to make the Security Council more representative of today's global realities. For this to be achieved, we must enhance the representation of regions that have been traditionally underrepresented, address the use of the veto, and enhance the Council's working methods, amongst others. We stand ready to continue engaging in constructive discussions on the 5 clusters of reform during the IGN to address such issues. We recall that the IGN remains the sole and legitimate platform for discussion on the reform of the Council. As part of the UFC group, Malta strongly believes in a reform that seeks to increase the number of elected members on the Council. An equitable regional distribution must be an integral part of our debate. As a small island nation, we strongly support the UFC's proposal for a rotating seat for small states and SIDS. This will enhance the chances for this category of countries to sit around the table and bring their own unique perspectives and realities to the discussion. Any proposal that seeks to increase the creation of new permanent members goes against the democratic principles that this body upholds. President, as our term as an elected member of the Security Council is coming to an end, allow me to highlight some of the tangible contributions and achievements of the elected 10, E10, over the past couple of years. On numerous occasions, we have come together and taken concrete action to break the Council's deadlock during a particularly sensitive and confrontational period. We did this because we all felt the duty and responsibility to carry out the work that we have been elected to do. The adoption of Resolution 2728 on the situation in the Middle East and the new E10-led resolution we are currently working on are a case in point. To conclude, President, as we are convening today after the Summit of the Future, let us use the convergence within the IGN to pursue a reform that is substantive, acceptable, and ratifiable. We encourage all negotiating groups to present concrete models or proposals during this session and urge all member states to work in good faith and patiently on areas of convergence. The UFC's all-encompassing and intermediate model responds to these calls. You can count on Malta's support towards these endeavors. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malta. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Spain, of Portugal, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. President. Very close, but not exactly the same thing, but thank you. Mr. President, dear distinguished delegates, at the outset, let me start by thanking you for engagement in promoting this constructive debate on the reform of the Security Council. In this regard, allow me to quote my Prime Minister, one of the more than 140 heads of state and government who referred to this matter in the latest high-level week. In his intervention at the last general debate, he called for a Security Council that is more representative, more agile, and more functional. We believe that the reform of the Council must be inclusive, transparent, and comprehensive, creating solutions that gather consensus among member states. It has been our long-standing view that the Council's current composition does not reflect the international community's diversity nor its present-day realities. We believe that consideration should be given to extending the number of both permanent and non-permanent members of the Council. This increase in inclusiveness, however, should not come at the expense of Council's efficiency. Portugal supports the common African position and the aspirations of Brazil and India to become permanent members. Small and medium-sized countries, in particular small island developing states, should also have their representation strengthened. Excellencies, the process of reforming the Security Council must also include the continuous improvement of its working methods. Portugal has been consistently defending this principle, especially when, as an elected member of the Council, we had the honor to chair the working group on documentation and other procedural matters. We will continue to strive for increased transparency, effectiveness, and legitimacy within the Council, also as members of the ACT group. In that regard, we encourage all members to join both the Franco-Mexican Declaration and the ACT Code of Conduct on the use of the veto, which currently has already 130 signatories, more than two-thirds of the membership. The veto initiative showed that there is consensus among member states on the need to increase scrutiny of the use of the veto. The right of veto, before being a power, represents a responsibility, and that's how it should be exercised. As far as working methods are concerned, we therefore support the limitation and greater scrutiny of the use of the veto. Article 27 of the Charter provides for a good faith approach in which parties to a dispute must abstain from voting. Yet, over the years, we have seen an increase in the use of veto, as well as situations where council members become parties to a conflict, acting simultaneously as judge and jury. On another note, we also hope to continue strengthening the relationship between the GA and the Security Council, including through our annual workshop co-organized with Ecuador and UNITAR early next year, and through an active discussion on the basis of the Assembly for Peace digital handbook, which we were proud to support. We concur with the need to have a council better articulated with the General Assembly, with a comprehensive view of security, recognizing climate change as an accelerator of conflict and the link between conflict and food insecurity. An articulation that could also more decisively address the promotion of WPS agenda and the YPS agenda as core elements of sustainable peace and security. We claim a council that fosters a global vision of security, considering conflict prevention, peace building, and sustaining peace, addressing new and emerging risks through holistic approaches. In this regard, we hope to see a closer cooperation with the PBC, along with more regular and substantive exchanges with representative regional organizations. Mr. President, we sincerely hope that the upcoming IGN will allow us to make decisive progress and to broaden the scope of the elements of consensus for the Security Council reform, increasing the effectiveness and credibility of the UN system and enhancing trust in multilateralism. The enormous challenges posed by the current geopolitical dynamics demand strong and urgent action to this end. Portugal is ready to continue supporting this process, and we encourage your leadership in this framework. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Portugal. And I now give the floor, finally, to the distinguished representative of Spain.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Spain, as a member of the United for Consensus group, aligns itself with the statement delivered by Italy, and we'd like to add three thoughts in our national capacity. First, the reform of the Security Council must be understood within the framework of strengthening multilateralism and re-establishing trust in international institutions, a goal that we have committed ourselves to most recently in the Pact for the Future. Secondly, the reform must be comprehensive, addressing the 5 questions that were identified in Decision 62557 of the General Assembly. Spain is opposed to an increase in the category of permanent members of the Security Council. Increasing the number of permanent members will only mean giving a few countries certain privileges that are totally contrary to equality between states, harming the interests of the majority of member states and worsening the functional problems of the Security Council. Thirdly, we believe that we must not delay in adopting measures to limit the use of the veto, which has very often caused inaction in the area of the maintenance of international peace and security that we are seeing today. We would recall that there are initiatives on the table to mitigate the scope and use of the veto, such as the French-Mexican proposal or the Act Code of Conduct, which have the support of the majority of the membership of the United Nations. Mr. President, you can count on the active participation of Spain to make progress on the reform of the Security Council in the framework of the IGN under the leadership of the excellent re-elected co-chairs, the permanent representatives of Austria and Kuwait. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Spain, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cambodia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, distinguished ambassador, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, let me express Cambodian appreciation for the reappointment of the co-chair and for convening today's IGN meeting on Security Council reform. My delegation fully believes in our co-chair leadership and diplomatic skill to further foster an inclusive, transparent atmosphere in order to realize a comprehensive reform of the Security Council. Cambodia commends the 79th section of the United Nations General Assembly for adopting the Pact for the Future. In line with this pact, Cambodia emphasized that Security Council reform should uphold the principle of multilateralism and cooperation, which are vital for strengthening global governance. We believe a reform council responsive to the evolving needs of our international community is essential to achieving the pact objectives. Mr. President, please allow me to highlight Cambodian view and position regarding this process of the Security Council reform as the following. First, Cambodia reaffirmed its support for a member state-driven approach to reform, as outlined in the General Assembly Decision 62/557, recognizing that member state voice must drive in this process. We welcome recent progress under the IGN framework, particularly in promoting transparency, inclusivity, and improving council working methods. Second, Cambodia advocates for expanding both permanent and non-permanent seats, particularly for developing nations. Greater inclusivity will reflect the diversity of our interconnected world, reinforcing the Council's legitimacy and capacity to addressing global challenges. We stand ready to work with all member states towards an inclusive and multilateral council. Third, Cambodia believes that the 5 clusters for Security Council reform are essential to a comprehensive and effective reform process. In this regard, Cameroon called for a consensus building and understanding of diverse perspectives, underscore the needs for transparency, inclusivity, and accountability in the Council. We believe also that strengthening engagement with all member states can foster a comprehensive approach to peace and security. Fourth, we value ongoing discussion on diverse reform model and encourage open dialogues over formal negotiation at this stage. While Cambodia acknowledges the urgency of reform, we caution against fixing timeline and rushing into text-based negotiation, which could risk deepening division. Instead, we support pragmatic, cooperative approach and that reflect the spirits of multilateralism. In closing, Mr. President, Cambodia reaffirmed its steadfast commitment to working alongside with all member states and the co-chair to achieve a truly effective, representative, and inclusive Security Council. We continue engaging constructively in the IGN process with the aim of making substantive progress this year towards a council that genuinely reflective of our diverse global community and capable of addressing the complex challenges of the 21st century. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cambodia. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia.
Thank you, President. Please allow me to thank the co-chairs, Ambassador Tariq Al-Banai of Kuwait and Ambassador Alexander Marshik of Austria, for their commitment and leadership in steering the intergovernmental negotiations on UN Security Council reform, IGN, during the 78th session of the General Assembly. Malaysia congratulates them on their reappointment and looks forward to continue our engagement throughout the 79th session. President, Malaysia welcomes the revised co-chair's elements paper on convergences and divergences on the question of equitable representation on an increase in the membership of the Security Council and related matters. The elements paper has captured the areas of agreement, convergences, and disagreement, divergences among member states regarding critical issues on the subject of Security Council reform. Most importantly, the elements paper is the essence of our shared commitment to reform the Council, to make it more representative, efficient, and transparent, and in doing so to strengthen its effectiveness and legitimacy. At the same time, the elements paper also highlights the continuing debates over expanding membership, particularly the issues of permanent and non-permanent seats, regional representation, and the use of veto. While these discussions can reveal differences in perspective, giving space for all voices enriches our deliberations and leads to more inclusive outcomes. Despite these convergences and divergences, Malaysia firmly believes that Security Council reform is not only essential, but in many respects unavoidable. President, the Security Council shoulders the important duty of maintaining international peace and stability, peace and security. Its decisions, successes, and failures have profound and far-reaching consequences that extend well beyond the Council chamber, shaping global stability and impacting nations and communities worldwide. It is in our interest to have a Security Council that is fit for purpose. The cost of having a divided and ineffective Security Council is catastrophic and far too high for the international community to bear. A weak and ineffective Security Council cannot guarantee global stability and leaves millions vulnerable to the ravages of conflict. The ongoing devastation and horror in Gaza, the persecution of the Rohingyas in Myanmar, and the protracted war in Ukraine, among numerous other conflicts, could have been resolved by a united and effective Security Council. Yet these tragedies continue to unfold while the Security Council remains paralyzed. President, this is precisely why Malaysia, alongside other member states, consistently calls for the reform of the Security Council. We insist that its members must effectively fulfill their role as custodians of international peace and security. The international community requires a Security Council that can decisively respond to current and future challenges. Malaysia supports a comprehensive reform of the Security Council, both in terms of its working methods and the expansion of its membership. My delegation maintains our call for the veto to be regulated and, in the long term, abolished, because it is ineffective and undemocratic. The veto in its current form is an obstacle to greater accountability and transparency in how the Security Council conducts its business. It is no longer justifiable for one permanent member of the Security Council to overrule the wishes of the overwhelming majority of member states. We support equitable and fair regional representation in a reformed Security Council. The geopolitical landscape has fundamentally transformed, requiring a council that mirrors today's diverse international community. To preserve its legitimacy and relevance, as well as enhance its effectiveness, the Security Council must be reformed into a more representative body. President, Malaysia's approach to the reform of the Security Council has always been pragmatic and objective. We have been consistent in advocating for an inclusive and transparent reform process, one that is guided by consultation and dialogue among member states. We remain convinced that a reformed Security Council will enjoy the widest possible acceptance among member states. Reforming the Council today will have a consequential impact on future generations. A more effective, democratic, and representative Security Council is essential to confront both contemporary challenges and emerging threats. In this regard, we urge all member states to demonstrate openness, flexibility, and greater political will to work towards a mutually acceptable conclusion in the interest of international peace, security, and prosperity. Let me conclude by assuring you of Malaysia's commitment to continue its constructive participation towards advancing this vital agenda. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malaysia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine.
Mr. President, the delegation of Ukraine expresses its gratitude for convening this debate and commends the willingness of the UNGA leadership to support the process of the Security Council reform. Ukraine has been a strong proponent of this reform long before we witnessed the Council's unpreparedness to properly respond to the Russian aggression. Now, as Russia exploits its presence in the permanent seat to advance its aggressive strategies, we reiterate that the urgency of the Security Council reform is clearly more than ever. In a week, we will reach a grave milestone of 1,000 days of war, the bloodiest conflict in the European continent since the Second World War. The Security Council has responded to this gravest security threat with over 100 meetings. Yet no substantial action has been taken to restore international peace and security. Given the unique tools at Russia's disposal to undermine any attempt by the responsible members of the Security Council to act, different outcomes could hardly be expected. We reiterate, therefore, that our efforts to create a robust roadmap towards more efficient Council will not succeed if the root cause of the Council's current failures remain of the raiders. And this is a tacit approval of de facto Russia's occupation of the Soviet permanent seat by circumventing necessary legal procedures envisaged by the UN Charter. The Council itself has been taken hostage of Russia's practice of using its platform to whitewash aggression and violations. Not only Council's attempt to act on the Ukrainian track have been blocked by Russia, but even an attempt to include Ukraine-related agenda item in a monthly program of work results in Russia blocking its adoption. And notably, this occurred this month, in November, and we commend the principled stance of the UK presidency, which refused to remove a scheduled meeting on Ukraine from the draft program of work to appease Russia. Spamming the Council's agenda with questions that could hardly align with its mandate, and retaliating by immediately requesting additional Council's meeting in response for those initiated by Ukraine and other Security Council members, are also among the dirty tricks widely employed by Russia. And the remedy for the deliberate strategy to immobilize and discredit the Council is closely related, though not limited, to the issue of veto. We know that this issue was in the focus of negotiations on IGN contribution to the pacts for the future. We commend that the pact contain clear acknowledgement that the question of the veto is a key element of the Security Council reform. We encourage the member states to uphold their commitment and to intensify efforts to reach an agreement on the future of the veto, including on limiting its scope and use. We are convinced that veto should not serve as a weapon for those who are driven by hatred and war. There are legitimate reasons for restricting the use of veto by a permanent member of the Security Council should therefore include cases of genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes, as well as conflict and situations a permanent member is involved in and cannot vote impartially due to the conflict of interests. Different out-of-box ideas should be brought to negotiating table as well, including the idea of empowering the UN General Assembly to overcome the veto. Mr. President, there are additional issues that my delegation considers vital for advancing the IGN process. First, we should open new avenues for progress if we agree on text-based negotiations. These steps would re-energize the process and strengthen its result-oriented nature. Second, we consider that any text intended as a basis for negotiation should properly reflect the entire range of positions and proposals, as well as acknowledge unchallenged proposals as commonalities. Among these unchallenged proposals is strengthened representation of the Eastern European Group in the Reformed Council. Mr. President, in conclusion, I would like to reiterate that the delegation of Ukraine will be ready to engage constructively throughout all clusters of negotiations with IGN co-chairs and all member states. We remain committed to contribute to our common goal of reforming the Security Council in order to make this organ fully operational and capable to effectively respond to gravest threats to international peace and security. And I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ukraine. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting, which is very important for the follow-up and implementation of the renewed commitment to Security Council reform, as demonstrated in the Pact for the Future. For the first time, specific directions and actions to reform the Security Council as a matter of priority were articulated in such a high-level and strategic document endorsed by all heads of state and government. This new urgency and momentum was in a large part owing to the work of the intergovernmental negotiations on Security Council reform in recent years. In this connection, my delegation would like to congratulate Ambassador Marschik of Austria and Ambassador Al-Banai of Kuwait for their reappointment as co-chairs of the IGN for the 79th session, as well as for their exemplary efforts and dedication to this process. Mr. President, transformation of the Security Council is key to reforming the United Nations and reinvigorate multilateralism, guided by international law and the UN Charter. To regain trust in global governance and international cooperation, especially in the context of increasing geopolitical tensions and escalating conflicts in many parts of the world, it is critical to redouble efforts to make the Security Council more representative, inclusive, transparent, efficient, effective, democratic, and accountable. To that end, my delegation wishes to highlight the following points. First, Vietnam attaches great importance to the IGN process and supports a comprehensive reform of the Security Council to improve its adaptability and relevance with today's realities. Since the last and only time the Council was enlarged nearly 6 decades ago, UN membership has grown by almost 80 countries. We are of the consistent view that the Council should be expanded in both categories, permanent and non-permanent membership, to enhance inclusion and representativeness. More seats should be allocated to the most underrepresented regions, especially to developing countries in Asia-Pacific and Africa, which would also contribute to rectifying the historical injustice done to the African continent. Second, the Security Council's expansion should be pursued in conjunction with efforts to improve its working methods with a view to ensuring greater democracy, transparency, and efficiency to better execute its mandate. Coordination between the Council and other principal organs of the UN, particularly the General Assembly, must be further strengthened, including through more regular consultations and reports, especially on matters that concern the majority of the wider UN membership. The Security Council should conduct more public meetings. Closed meetings and informal consultations should be kept to a minimum as exceptions. The Council should also consult more with the troop and police contributing countries on the issues related to UN peacekeeping operations, as well as further strengthen cooperation with regional organizations when addressing issues related to them. Non-council members should be given more access and participation in the preparation of documents and reports of the Council, including its annual reports to the General Assembly, which was proposed by Vietnam as an initiative in its first tenure as non-permanent member of the Security Council in 2008. And very importantly, the use of the veto should be restrained and limited to only measures under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. Third, Vietnam supports all meaningful measures to advance the work of the IGN as a member state-driven process, including the introduction of additional features that are common in other UN negotiation processes. In this regard, we welcome the holding of the structured dialogues on models, alongside continued deliberations on the 5 clusters of issues relating to reform, which is essential to promote convergence and practical outcomes. To conclude, Mr. President, let me reaffirm Vietnam's full support and unwavering commitment to engage constructively to this important process of reforming the Security Council. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Vietnam. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Barbados.
Mr. President, colleagues, I wish to express our appreciation for convening today's meeting. I join with others in congratulating the co-chairs of the IGN for their remarkable work during the last session and on their reappointment. Barbados has full confidence that their continued leadership will inject fresh momentum into these critical negotiations. Further, Barbados aligns itself with a statement delivered by the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines on behalf of the L69 group. Mr. President, colleagues, today, perhaps more than ever, the world needs a reformed and well-functioning Security Council. 6 decades have passed since the Council's last major reform. In that time, our world has transformed dramatically. More than 80 countries have become UN members, including my own. Yet the Council's structure and practices have not kept pace. As we confront unprecedented challenges to global security, from the climate crisis to conflicts to economic and social instability, it is clear that reform is not a matter of choice, but one of necessity. In this IGN session, Barbados underscores the following 4 points. First, we must reform without delay, reflecting the pressing urgency of the global challenges we face and the commitments we all undertook in the Pact for the Future. Second, Barbados joins others in welcoming recent steps initiated by the IGN co-chairs to enhance transparency and accessibility. We commend the introduction of webcasting for the first segment of IGN meetings and the establishment of an IGN repository website to host relevant documents. These advancements are significant steps forward, enabling all member states, large and small, to remain informed and engaged. Third, in accordance with the L69 group position, Barbados also advocates for structured text-based negotiations to fulfill the mandates of Decision 62/557 and the commitments of the Pact for the Future. The creation of a single attributed document to capture member states' positions and track convergence is essential for moving beyond broad discussions to a genuine negotiation process that respects and incorporates the contributions of all member states. Fourth, and finally, as regards the membership of the Council, Barbados considers that both the permanent and non-permanent categories of the Council should be expanded to ensure more equitable geographic representation of the current membership of the United Nations. To this end, we reiterate our support for Africa's representation in the permanent category, as reflected in the Common African Position, the Azulini Consensus, and the Sirte Declaration. We further defend the urgent need to include unrepresented and increase the participation of underrepresented regions, including my own region of Latin America and the Caribbean. And we strongly advocate for the creation of a rotating seat for small island developing states. Mr. President, colleagues, at the general debate in September of this year, my Prime Minister joined many others in dealing with this issue before us. She called for a reset of our global institutions to enhance their legitimacy, representativity, and effectiveness. You and the co-chairs of the IJN may count on Barbados's cooperation as together we work to reset the Council to reflect our contemporary realities and the hopes and aspirations of the people of the world. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Barbados, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Lao People's Democratic Republic.
Mr. President, at the outset, my delegation would like to express our sincere appreciation to you, Mr. President, for convening this important meeting, particularly when the international community is being confronted with numerous challenges threatening global peace and security. The Lao PDR joins the call for enhancing the effectiveness of the United Nations to maintain peace and security and address the most pressing needs in accordance with the United Nations Charter. We commend the co-chairs of the Intergovernmental Negotiation, IGN, on Security Council reform, Ambassador Alexander Marshik, Permanent Representative of Austria, and Ambassador Tariq Al-Banai, Permanent Representative of Kuwait, for their outstanding leadership in initiatives, particularly through webcasting the IGN debates and establishing the IGN depository website. These initiatives have significantly increased transparency, inclusivity, and effectiveness while preserving the institutional memory of this reform process. On this note, my delegation joins others in congratulating the co-chairs on their well-deserved reappointment. We look forward to further advancing the process under their guidance during the 79th session. Mr. President, since its inception, the IGN has been the primary member state-driven platform to address the UN Security Council reform agenda. We remain hopeful that through mutual trust and constructive dialogue, a consensual outcome that is acceptable to all will be achieved, in line with the General Assembly Decision 62/557 and other relevant resolutions and decisions. Lao PDR reaffirms its support for the UNSC reform through the IGN process, which remains comprehensive, transparent, inclusive, and balanced. It is essential to ensure that any new or revised models submitted by states and groups of states are structured dialogues that will address equitable geographical representation and reflect the interest of both developed and developing member states. Our common goal, as reflected in the Pact for the Future, is to create a consolidated model founded on convergences across the 5 clusters. In this regard, we believe that expanding both permanent and non-permanent membership categories will make the reform of the UNSC more representative and meet the aspirations of all member states. Mr. President, in conclusion, throughout this 79th session, Lao PDR remains committed to working closely with all member states to achieve substantive progress in the UNSC reform process. We pledge our full support to the co-chairs and the IGN process as we strive forward towards more inclusive, effective, and representative UN Security Council. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Lao People's Democratic Republic, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Georgia.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to extend gratitude to His Excellency Mr. Tariq Al-Banai, Permanent Representative of State of Kuwait to the UN, and Mr. Alexander Marshik, Permanent Representative of the Republic of Austria to the UN, for their efforts and the work done during the past session. We welcome reappointment of the co-chairs of the intergovernmental negotiations and assure them of my mission's full support in further advancing this process. Excellencies, in the face of the dramatic developments of the last several years, it has become clear that aggravated conflict dynamics have put in question the ability of the Security Council to effectively fulfill its primary purpose, the maintenance of international peace and security. The recently adopted Pact for the Future echoes the necessity of relevant actions to this end, and underlines a universal commitment to support credible, timely, and decisive action by the Security Council in exercise of its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. We also welcome that the Pact for the Future duly reflects the importance of the Member States-driven nature of the reform of the Security Council. Let me reiterate our hope that IGM process will address pertinent issues before us, with the aim to contribute to the important role of the Council, enabling it to live up to its raison d'être. During past sessions, Georgia submitted and voiced its position on the Security Council reform, which cover all 5 aspects of it. Let me underline that we support the reform of the Security Council in terms of its equitable representation and enlargement. We encourage the expansion of both permanent and non-permanent categories of membership, as it will increase the legitimacy, authority, and credibility of the Council. Our particular priority is the allocation of the additional seat to the Eastern European Group, so that we have a better regional representation and parity in the Security Council. We fully support allocation of additional seats for the African Group, in line with the Esselwini Consensus and the CERT Declaration. At the same time, we stand for allocation of seats for smaller states and small island developing states across all regions, in order for the basic principle of international law, sovereign equality between the nations to be more explicitly reflected at the core of the international security architecture. However, as was made many times before, we believe that a meaningful reform should also imply reform of the use of veto, the working methods and decision-making principles of the Security Council, as well as more accountability before the General Assembly. In this regard, we welcome the GA resolution on standing mandate for a General Assembly debate when a veto is cast in the Security Council, to which Georgia is one of the main sponsors. As repeatedly stated, we believe that the right of veto should be limited in cases where a member is involved in the conflict in question and therefore cannot objectively exercise its rights. Article 27/3 of the UN Charter states that in a series of specific important decisions, a party to a dispute shall abstain from voting. On numerous occasions, international community has experienced a detrimental effect that abuse of the veto right by a permanent member of the Security Council may have on maintenance of international peace and security. In 2008, Georgia experienced on itself the inability of Security Council to adequately address Russia's aggression against Georgia. Distinguished colleagues, it is of paramount importance that the principles of the UN Charter are respected. I would also like to recall another commitment reflected in the Pact for the Future, which envisages accelerating our efforts towards achieving, quote, an agreement on the future of the veto, including discussions on limiting its scope and use. The question of the veto is a key element of Security Council reform. We will intensify efforts to reach an agreement on the future of the veto, including discussions on limiting its scope and use, unquote. Our position on the limitation of the veto power is clear. We fully support the political statement on the suspension of the veto in cases of mass atrocities presented by France and Mexico during the 70th session of the GA and the ACT Code of Conduct concerning the Security Council action against genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. In conclusion, let me once again express our readiness to further promote the IGN process. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Georgia, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. I'm sorry. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Democratic Republic of Korea.
Mr. President, at the outset, allow me to congratulate the permanent representative of the Kuwait and Austria on their appointment as a co-chair of the intergovernmental negotiation on the UN Security Council reform. Mr. President, the UN Security Council reform is one of the most important and pressing tasks at the present, in the light of the complex trend of the current international situation and for building of the peaceful and stabilized world. Delegation of the DPRK is affirming that the UN Security Council must comprehensively reform to meet demand of the time and would like to clarify its position as follows. First, UN Security Council should responsibly discharge its mission and role enshrined in the UN Charter by thoroughly observing the principles of impartiality and objectivity. UN Security Council, which has a primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security, is now unable to properly perform its functions due to unfair and double standards of some member states of the UN Security Council. Since outbreak of the conflict in Gaza Strip last year, October, UN Security Council has repeatedly failed to adopt the resolution calling for immediate ceasefire due to United States' veto, despite international community's strong desire for peace and stability in the Middle East. It is indeed extreme double standard to disparage the just and legitimate exercise of the DPRK's right to self-defense, which caused no harm to the neighboring country, whereas inhumane atrocity committed by Israel are justified as an exercise of the right to self-defense, which massacres tens of thousands of innocent civilians in Gaza Strip. As long as the United States continues to use UN Security Council as a political tool to realize their strategic interests, UN Security Council will never be able to regain trust of the international community. Second, UN Security Council should be reformed in the principle of ensuring full representation of the non-allied and other developing countries. Developing countries account for more than half of the UN member states. Therefore, granting developing countries equal representation is a key issue in the building democratic UN Security Council. In this regard, my delegation insists that priority should be given to the guaranteeing the representation of the developing country, and that expansion of the non-permanent members where consensus is possible be given priority. Third, Japan should never be allowed to take permanent seat at the UN Security Council. Japan is an A-class war criminal state that invaded many Asian countries, including my own country, by force in the past, and committed crime against humanity that cannot be washed away. It committed extra large-scale crimes against humanity unprecedented in human history, such as forcible abduction and massacre of the millions of Korean people and sexual slavery of 200,000 Korean women for Japanese army. Nevertheless, Japan, instead of sincerely apologizing and compensating for its past crime, is now beautifying its history of the aggression and accelerating its scheme for militarization and external expansion. It is a mockery of an insult to the United Nations that a country like Japan is seeking the permanent seat at the UN Security Council, whose main responsibility is to maintain international peace and security. UN Security Council will have no seat to be granted to Japan, who denies its past crimes and refuses to apologize and compensate. In conclusion, my delegation hopes that the UN Security Council will be reformed in the most impartial and democratic manner through full negotiation and conformity with unanimous aspiration and desire of the humankind for international peace and security. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United States sees reforming the UN Security Council as an important element of a broader effort to ensure that the UN is effective, representative, and credible. During High Level Week, President Biden reaffirmed his commitment to Security Council reform, and the United States announced additional policy positions that we believe are widely supported and practical. These new policy positions are in addition to our long-standing positions on Council reform. First, we announced that we support adding 2 permanent seats for Africa. We also announced that we support adding a rotating seat for small island developing states to ensure that these important voices have consistent representation. And third, we announced that we support engaging in text-based negotiations as the best way to make real progress on this issue and move from discussion to action. The United States looks forward to continued and fulsome engagement in established channels and discussions on reform, including on intergovernmental negotiations process. We are also encouraged that this past September, the members of the IGN took a significant step forward by collectively agreeing to detailed parameters for Security Council reform in the Pact of the Future. The Pact gives us new momentum going into the new IGN session to make meaningful progress towards Security Council reform. We extend our sincere gratitude to the IGN co-chairs, the permanent representatives of Austria and Bahrain, for their extraordinary efforts in helping foster important and constructive discussions on UN Security Council reform, and we look forward to engaging in the year ahead. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States. I now give the floor to to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we note the energetic efforts of the permanent representative of Qatar, Tarek Al-Banai, and the permanent representative of Austria, Alexandra Marshik, in leading the negotiations during the 78th session of the United Nations General Assembly. We trust that the co-coordinators in this session once more will be guided by the principles of impartiality and will closely consider the opinions of all participants in the process. Security Council reform is crucial. It is long overdue as a task on the agenda of the organization amid the swift forming of a more democratic and multipolar world order. Having said that, the path toward compromise in choosing the ideal modalities for a revitalized council has encountered many problems, which shows how significant the role and the responsibilities of these bodies are in accordance with the UN Charter. The decisions of the Security Council play a determinative role in settling armed conflicts. That is why the price of error in this question is unbelievably high. The Russian Federation, as a permanent council member, has always held that this body must be more representative. This should be done by enhancing the representation of developing states in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. There is an imperative here. It is and remains redressing the historic injustice done to Africa. Africa's current representation on the Council is fully out of step with the total number of states on the continent and with its modern role in international affairs. Those who track the work of the Security Council see absolutely clearly an unjustifiable and unjust slant in its membership toward Western states which represent a disproportionately small share of the population of the world, not to mention the fact that this category of countries adheres to a bloc approach that is, in the overwhelming majority of cases, they're practically identical in approach. Thus, broadening their representation would not bring to the work of this body the pluralism of opinions, which is so necessary, but it would merely stand in the way of finally shaking off obsolete colonial principles. Furthermore, it is vital to maintain in Security Council reform the ability for the Council to swiftly and effectively respond to emerging threats to international peace and security. The world will pay dearly if a body which is very representative on paper lags behind events which require an immediate response. In this regard, we favor keeping the Council's membership compact. The ideal number of Council members should be in the low 20s, no more than that. Mr. President, we do not support the initiative that would infringe on the prerogatives of current permanent members of the Council. That includes the veto. One should bear in mind that this institution is a key factor which brings the members of the Council to seek balanced decisions. The use or threat of use of the veto has time and again freed the UN from being pulled into dubious undertakings. In recent years, the Council really has used the veto more frequently. However, one should not look only at the statistics. A substantial number of Western members have used their comfortable majority on the Council to either propose draft decisions without holding due consultations, or they have deliberately provoked their opponents into using the veto. We have consistently uncovered these disingenuous methods which undermined the authority of the Council. One should understand that without the veto, the Council would turn into an entity that just rubber stamps documents in uncontrolled fashion, documents that are only good for a small number of countries, and the UN would suffer the unenviable fate of the League of Nations then. The Founding Fathers wanted to avoid that from happening. That's why they came up with the right of the veto, which today plays a key role guaranteeing efficiency and stability in Security Council decisions, whether or not people like that. It's clear that one should not abuse the right to veto as we see today, for example, in the context around Gaza, where the U.S. has prevented a ceasefire acting in the interests of Israel. However, the problem here isn't the right to veto as such, but rather the irresponsible behavior of a specific member of the Security Council. It's important to point that out. President, the negotiations today demonstrate a genuine desire on the part of the overwhelming majority of member states to find an optimal model for Security Council reform. Yet it's clear that a universal decision that would satisfy everyone or almost everyone is not yet in view. In these conditions, we see no alternative to continuing in this session of the General Assembly to carefully, step-by-step work to ensure convergence, to consider, continue to hear all of the concepts and ideas that enrich our discussion. Progress in Security Council forum cannot be reached by imposing on member states parallel negotiating tracks, including those associated with the Pact for the Future, and it can't happen through artificial deadlines for conclusion of negotiations. The key task is to carefully consider the broad gamut of positions of all member states in order to ensure a genuinely multilateral principle in terms of decision-making. The intergovernmental negotiations are a unique, universal in their legitimacy for the whole complex of reforms. Moving away from that format in favor of other fora would not be desirable and would roll progress back by many years. We are convinced that if there's political will on the part of the member states, we'll continue to work constructively, which will ultimately lead to balanced decisions which are satisfying to all members of our organization. There are no constructive alternatives to this approach. However, undue haste, radicalism, or the imposition of certain models that are only good for certain groups of states, these are all unacceptable, and they could imperil not only the efficient functioning of the Council, but they could undermine the foundations of our organization, which has already been working for 80 years. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening this debate and for giving me the floor. Kenya aligns with the statement delivered by the permanent representative of Sierra Leone on behalf of the African Group. I will make some additional remarks in my national capacity. At the outset, I salute the President of the General Assembly for his pragmatic leadership, particularly in appointing His Excellency Ambassador Tarek Al-Banai, Permanent Representative of the State of Kuwait, and His Excellency Ambassador Alexander Mashik, Permanent Representative of Austria, as co-chairs of the intergovernmental negotiations on the reform of the UN Security Council during the 79th session. We have every confidence that the co-chairs will continue to guide the IGN to greater progress, building upon the remarkable achievements registered during the 78th session. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, this debate comes against the backdrop of the historic Summit of the Future and the adoption of the Action-Oriented Pact for the Future. Under Action 39, our political leaders committed to reforming the Security Council, recognizing the urgent need to make it more representative, inclusive, transparent, efficient, effective, democratic, and accountable. They further reaffirmed their faith in the IGN, pledging to strengthen their efforts within the framework as a matter of priority and without delay. With these undertakings, Excellencies, our leaders have clearly instructed that we should, without further delay, take bold, ambitious, and decisive actions towards a Security Council that is truly representative, inclusive, transparent, efficient, effective, democratic, and accountable. A council that has the trust and confidence of all member states, and a council that delivers in the interest of international peace and security. In this regard, Kenya welcomes the decision of the IGN co-chairs to immediately begin negotiations for the 79th session, focusing on the 5 cluster areas, as well as the models presented by individual member states and groups of states, including revised models based on the discussions held during the 78th session. Kenya will participate constructively in the IGN, convinced that equitable representation and inclusive participation are hallmarks of good governance in all contexts, and yet lacking in the UN Security Council. Indeed, the Security Council is increasingly divided, indecisive, and unable to effectively discharge its critical mandate because it largely remains under the control of a few powerful states whose overarching objective is to protect and project their individual interests. Nothing illustrates the iniquity in the current Security Council configuration better than the underrepresentation and the non-representation of Africa in the non-permanent and permanent member categories, respectively. This state of affairs is one of the many continuing historical injustices that have confined Africa to the margins of decision-making processes, even on matters that concern and affect it the most. Kenya is encouraged that under the Pact for the Future, our leaders committed to redress the historical injustice against Africa as a priority and to treat Africa as a special case. This decision is a solid endorsement of the long-standing quest to correct this wrong and usher in an era where Africa is equitably represented in the Security Council as envisioned by the African Common Position articulated in the Ezulwini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration. We thank the many member states that continue to stand in solidarity with Africa in this regard, and we urge universal support, noting that ensuring Africa's adequate representation in the Security Council in both categories of membership is not only a matter of fairness, but also a pragmatic necessity for fostering inclusive and effective global governance. Concerning the increase in the membership of the Security Council, my delegation believes that the reform must include both permanent and non-permanent categories. If we focus on a single category, we will only succeed in making cosmetic changes while perpetuating and perhaps worsening the existing iniquities and inefficiencies of the Council. A holistic approach to reform that encompasses both categories of membership would contribute more meaningfully towards a balanced, inclusive, and representational Council reflective of the contemporary geopolitical landscape. We call for the abolition of the veto, but if it is to be retained in a reformed Council, it should, as a matter of common justice and equity, be extended to new permanent members with all its prerogatives and privileges. I wish to underscore in conclusion that we owe it to ourselves and future generations to shape a Security Council that mirrors the present and geopolitical realities and capable of delivering effectively in the maintenance of international peace and security. I reaffirm my delegation's unwavering commitment to working with all member states in this regard, and I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Kenya, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uruguay.
Mr. President, firstly, allow me to express our thanks for you having convened this meeting on a very important issue, the maintenance of international peace and security, and the architecture to bring that about. And we welcome the coordination of our work in the IGN by the two co-chairs, our distinguished colleagues from Kuwait and Austria. This new step follows on from the agreements of the Pact for the Future, that particularly actions 39 and 40. On the basis of these guidelines, we would like to recall some aspects and goals that we feel are central. Amongst them, to ensure that the Security Council acts more efficiently, that the organ adjusts to this third decade of the 21st century and doesn't stay stuck in the last century. We need to have more adequate representation of countries on the Council, particularly developing countries, both from Africa, Asia, and Latin America and the Caribbean. And we also need to look at situations of small island developing states. The democracy within the Council cannot be solved by simply increasing permanent and non-permanent members. With regard to the veto, the better thing would be to ban this, but that is not realistic at the moment, and there won't be a consensus on this item. That being the case, the existence of the mechanism needs to be discussed through a review clause to the agreement that we adopt. And we think that the G4 proposal on not having a use of veto for new members joining the Security Council of permanent members is something to consider. With regard to the Council specifically, we need to make this more democratic, particularly with regard to the number of non-permanent members or elected members. We could agree to increasing the permanent and the non-permanent members, but the critical importance here is that there be a significant increase in non-permanent members, because that is what will ensure that there is greater democracy, because all members of the organization will be able to vote for these elected members. This would, we don't want an imbalance between new categories, however, with regard to regional representation, clearly we need to repair this historic injustice suffered by African countries and increase representation for Asia and Latin America as well. That is stressed in the Pact for the Future. With regard to Latin America and the Caribbean, we hope that our region will be able to double its representation, so we'll have at least 2 additional members in the Council added to the 2 currently that we have, either as new permanent or non-permanent members. The number of members overall should be around 27. This would make it possible for non-permanent members and new members from Africa, Latin America and Asia to make their voices heard, and also small island developing states and African Arab countries must also be given greater attention. There must be equitable geographic distribution as mentioned in the Charter. But we can't be talking about regional representation, because the countries on the Council are representing countries and act individually. One thing that is important for the functioning of the Council is that we need to regulate the mechanism for the use of the veto and other working procedures. Particularly, we need to apply the limits of Article 27.3 of the Charter when a permanent member is a party to a dispute. And also, we need to include the Code of Conduct of the ACT group and the French-Mexican initiative on limiting the use of the veto in certain cases linked to massive violations of human rights. These kinds of initiatives do not require reforms of the Charter, and can be defined by the General Assembly under its mandate. The current political situation means that we need to make progress with these reforms, and we are prepared to work on this through the discussion of a basic document, or in any event, we need to make sure that this process is not delayed by discussion on form. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Uruguay. I now give the floor to the last speaker, the distinguished observer of the Interparliamentary Union. You have the floor.
Thank you. It is my great honor to address this assembly on an issue of vital importance to the world and to the future of the United Nations. The reform of the Security Council can't wait any longer. This 79th session of the General Assembly needs to take decisive action toward a more representative council, better equipped to preserve the peace according to the international rule of law. As you all know, the United Nations was established in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, first and foremost to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Based on the principle of collective security, the Security Council was created as a nimble body of limited membership to take action in response to threats to the peace anywhere they occur. The 5 nations that were victorious in the war assumed special responsibility for the preservation of the peace, and for this they were given permanent status as well as veto powers. How the world has changed since then. Not only has UN membership more than tripled, but the balance of power has shifted greatly in the past 80 years. We've gone from a bipolar world to a multipolar order, from a world dominated by nation-states to one where non-state actors, including multinational corporations, exert their own considerable influence. In short, while the geopolitics of the world have changed dramatically since 1945, the Security Council has not evolved at the same pace. To be sure, it's improved, particularly in its working methods, which are more open and transparent. The decision 3 years ago that any use of the veto must be explained before the General Assembly has sent a signal in the right direction. But the fundamental change process for a more representative council has gone nowhere for far too long, and the repeated recourse to the veto has had dramatic consequences which cannot be ignored. For too many years now, as conflict theaters have erupted or allowed to fester, the Security Council was stuck in stalemate, unable to act. The human cost is staggering. The risk of a war getting out of control and engulfing the whole world has grown exponentially. As an organization devoted to peace and development through democracy, and with a strong belief in the UN-led multilateral system, the Interparliamentary Union is keenly aware of this untenable situation. Members of Parliament around the world have taken note as well. This is why in March of this year, the IPU Standing Committee on United Nations Affairs for the first time adopted a motion on Security Council reform. The motion recognizes that while it is you, the governments of this world, who lead negotiations, parliaments need to do their part in pushing for change from the bottom up. In particular, the motion calls on parliaments to ask for regular briefings from their respective ministers and permanent representatives on the reform process, to demand that the process is undertaken democratically, inclusively, and transparently, and to prepare for the ratification of the final decision in accordance with UN Charter. This motion is one part of a broader effort by the IPU to strengthen the multilateral system, beginning with the most urgent step of Security Council reform. It seeks to build traction for the reform process at the national level and among we the peoples, who are ultimately at the receiving end of all UN decisions. As we approach the 80th anniversary of the United Nations next year, the IPU's 181 members will keep pressing for action on this motion in the hope that their engagement will help build momentum for the adoption of a final reform package with no further delay. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished observer of the Interparliamentary Union. Dear colleague, we have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item. The exercise of the right of reply has been requested. May I remind members that statements in the exercise of the right of reply are limited to 10 minutes for the first intervention and to 5 minutes for the second intervention, and should be made by delegations from their seats. I call on the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just wanted to quickly respond to a statement made by North Korea. It is truly regrettable as the sexual slavery system of Japanese army, forcible drafting of Koreans and forced labor, and the genocide cannot fade away even in the passage of time or whatever the tricks it employed. Statute of limitations cannot be applied here. Japanese politicians openly and regularly visit the Yasuni Shrine, haunted by the specter of militarism. This clearly proves that it remains utterly unchanged in its wild ambition for launching re-invasion. It is open secret that Japan has steadily renewed and expanded its military muscle into attack type by throwing off the principle of exclusive defense, under which Japan is constitutionally bound to give up war and has no right of war potentials and belligerency, and is allowed only to possess the minimum defense capability if necessary. Japan plans to allocate approximately $5 billion, which is nearly 1/10 of the biggest ever 2024 defense budget, running up to $51.7 billion for the purchase and development of long-range missiles. This clearly shows that Japan is desperately resorting to the possession of the capability for preemptive attack. Japan's rearmament is a wanton violation of the UN Charter and a serious challenge to the international peace and security. On the other hand, the Japanese government is now discharging nuclear polluted water from the Fukushima atomic power plant into the sea, despite the opposition and warning of the international community. It is undeniable that the discharge of polluted water into the sea is an unethical act of destroying the geopolitical, geo-ecological environment and the act of threatening the very existence of mankind, for the polluted water contains huge amounts of radioactive materials. Japan is now trying to deceive and mock the international community by claiming that the nuclear polluted water has been filtered by the polynuclide clearing equipment into clean water, but it has been scientifically proven that the clean water still contains a large amount of extremely dangerous radioactive nuclei, including cesium, strontium, and ruthenium, as well as tritium. Insisting on its inherent stingy calculation that the relevant expenses and labor costs are low, Japan is bent on discharging the nuclear polluted water into the sea in disregard of the strong protests and warning at home and abroad. It is the unethical crime against humanity for Japan to have no scruples about inflicting a nuclear disaster upon mankind for its selfish purposes. This demonstrates the two-faced features of Japan, who is trumpeting about nuclear threat from neighboring countries and advocating the nuclear-free world. Japan should immediately withdraw its decision on dangerous discharge of nuclear polluted water that would seriously threaten the health and safety as well as the future of mankind. Thank you, Mr. President.
I call on Japan for its second intervention. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's truly regrettable that I have to respond to North Korean statement again. Their statement is totally groundless and ill-intentioned. So I don't repeat our position regarding that. It's simply unacceptable. But regarding the Alps treated water, it's nothing to do with today's discussion regarding the Security Council reform. But just in case, I wanted to make clear our position, which is that the government of Japan has sincerely explained Japan's efforts to ensure its safety at the international conferences and bilateral meetings. In this respect, Japan would like to emphasize that after 2 years of rigorous review, the IAEA concluded in its comprehensive report of July 2023 that the discharge of Alps treated water into the sea is consistent with relevant international safety standards, and that the discharge will have a negligible radiological impact on people and the environment. Since August of last year, when the discharge of Alps treated water began, the discharge has been carried out safely as planned, in full compliance with international standards. Multi-layered monitoring activities by Japan with the involvement of the IAEA have found no anomalies. The level of radioactive nuclides, including tritium or others, in the discharged water have been far below the regulatory standards. The result of all these monitoring activities have been made available to the public. Japan will continue to explain its efforts to the international community in a transparent manner and is ready to engage in discussions based on scientific evidence at the appropriate fora with relevant expertise. And just to make sure that, make it clear, the water being discharged is not so-called nuclear contaminated water, as it is discharged after sufficient purification and dilution. It will have no impact on people and the environment. So just for your all information, thank you very much, Mr. President.
I call on the representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea for its second intervention. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to once again protest that the Japanese delegate behaved in a rude and uncivilized manner in this August chamber. He called the DPRK again as North Korea. That is quite a rude and uncivilized manner. And then I'd like to emphasize that Japan is a country that has neither the moral qualification nor the justification to look over the permanent membership of the UN Security Council. It is the country which endangers the whole humanity. Thank you, Mr. President.
The General Assembly has thus concluded this stage of its consideration of Agenda Item 122. I would want to thank the interpreters and the delegation for their patience and for staying a few extra minutes to allow us to complete the debate on this item. The meeting is adjourned.